Hey, New City. Another good day today at New City Church downtown. Loved hanging out with you guys and listening to Josh's band do a great job. Another week in Mark and a great passage in Mark chapter 10, 32 through 45. A passage that looks a lot like something that we covered in Mark chapter 9. Very, very similar. Jesus, in heading now to Jerusalem, pulls his disciples to the side to tell them what's in store and what lies ahead, that he would suffer and die. And this week a lot more details than the Mark chapter 9 passage, and we talk about that during the sermon, but the similarity is that the disciples respond in both cases in a very similar way. Jesus pours out his heart and he tells them what's about to happen, and he's warning them, telling them he'll suffer and he'll die, and on the third day he'll be raised. And as weird as it seems to us, the disciples' immediate response is to ask about a position of power or authority. In chapter 9 it was who is the greatest among us. That was their discussion as soon as Jesus finished telling them what they were facing. And here James and John approach Jesus and ask Jesus, hey, can one of us be on your right hand and one of us on your left hand when you come in glory? And it shows us a couple of things. It shows us, one, that the disciples are really slow to learn, just like we're slow to learn. And it also shows us that the disciples have a broken heart. Sin has broken us and blinded us. And we're just like the disciples. You know, here they have Jesus, and we talk about this climactic point in human history when he is going to fulfill those promises of God and establish his kingdom, and how it will come with his betrayal, with his suffering, his death, but how he'll overcome death and conquer it through his resurrection. And at this climactic point in history, here are the disciples worrying about, thinking about their place and their position. Jesus goes on to answer the disciples, and he talks about the cup and the baptism that James and John could never share with him, in one sense, in the sense that it will be God's wrath poured out on Jesus, the gospel for us, God's wrath poured out on Jesus, Jesus dying the death that we deserve, and being raised from that. And in that sense, as he is our substitution, substituting himself in our place, there was no way that James and John could possibly share in that cup or in that baptism. But Jesus says in another way they will, meaning that they will suffer and ultimately that they too will die. I didn't mention it in the sermon, but 10 of the 12 disciples died a martyr's death. The only two that didn't would be John and Judas. Judas hanged himself after betraying Jesus, and John, I don't know how John didn't die a martyr, but by God's will. They tried to stone John, and he lived. They tried boiling him alive, and John lived through it. So finally they said, all right, we can't kill this guy, we'll put him on an island. So John too suffered indeed, but not in the same way that Jesus did. Jesus bore the wrath of God, and Jesus died our death for us. And Jesus also corrects the thinking of the disciples when he talks about how their thought of place in the kingdom was associated with the Gentiles' thinking of lordship and a place of authority. Jesus says that's not the way it is in the kingdom. If you're going to lead in the kingdom, then you have to be a servant and a slave to all. Neither of those positions, servant or slave, or positions of prestige or power. And in fact, they're just the opposite of that. They are subservient. They are humbling. And that's exactly what Jesus was calling the disciples to, humble service. In fact, Jesus is showing us that he is a humble servant. He came, he says in verse 45, not to serve, not to be served rather, but to serve. And he's calling the disciples to the exact same thing. One of the things that I pointed out in the sermon is that our problem is very similar to that of the disciples. You have this great climactic point in human history, and the disciples were living in it, and we do in a similar fashion, as he's called us to this same mission of redemption and restoration, and yet we are busy thinking about so many other things and pursuing so many other things. We're blinded. We sometimes become so self-absorbed that we forget about this great task that he's called us to, and this great mission that is before us, and blinded, we tend to become self-absorbed. We tend to think more of ourselves than others. We tend to desire to be served rather than to serve, and we're just as guilty as the disciples. How do we serve? We're called to be servants like Jesus is a servant. How do we serve? Gosh, there's so many different ways, and we run through just a brief list of that in the sermon. So many different ways that we can serve. I think really the big challenge this week is to set aside the idol of self, to humble ourselves and take on Jesus. It's a part of our sanctification to humble ourselves, to consider others as more highly than ourselves, and to serve, to find ways and places to serve, whether it's just to have lunch with someone, to listen to their problems, to walk with them through life. All of that is a way to serve. Serve in the nursery at New City. Serve at the coffee bar at New City. Serve as a volunteer in the city. Serve in your missional community. Tons and tons and tons of places that we can serve if we're willing to root out the idol of self and to take on the image of Jesus. An amazing thing. Jesus is truly an example to us, but much more than an example to us. Jesus is our Redeemer. Jesus is our Savior. Jesus is the promised Messiah. And all of that, in all of that, he is our King. Jesus is our King, but he is a king of a different kingdom, and he is a suffering servant leader. And that's what he calls us to be, suffering servant leaders. So I'm thankful as we think about all the different places of service. I'm very thankful for those who serve at New City. I hope you'll encourage your MC not just to serve where they're not serving, but to be thankful for the places that they are. I thank you, MC leaders, for all that you do. It's amazing. We are here and do what we do because of you. All right, I don't want to preach the whole sermon again, but I love you guys. Encourage your groups where they're not serving to serve, to root out the self-centered idol in their life, the idol of self, and encourage them. Give thanks. Thank your MC for serving. Thank the people who serve already in so many different ways. I thank you. All right, love you guys. See you soon. Bye.